Claire tightened her grip on the steering wheel as her car wound along the narrow, fog-drenched road leading into Whispering Hollow. The town was tucked away in the Appalachian foothills, a place she hadn't visited since childhood. She had come to settle her late grandmother's affairs, but as the spire of the old church emerged through the haze, an inexplicable chill ran down her spine. The town seemed frozen in time. Weathered buildings lined the main street, and few residents lingered outside. Whispering Hollow had always been quiet, but now it felt unnervingly so. As Claire pulled up to her grandmother's house, a sense of melancholy washed over her. The house was exactly as she remembered it, modest and unassuming, with ivy creeping up the walls. Inside, the air smelled faintly of lavender and old paper. Claire found her grandmother's journal in the living room, its leather cover worn and soft. Flipping through its pages, she discovered cryptic entries about the church. The silence is not natural. It takes more than sound. It steals memory, identity. The ritual must hold. Claire frowned, unsure what to make of it. She set the journal aside and unpacked her belongings, hoping a good night's sleep would clear her head. But that night, her dreams were filled with shadows and a deafening absence of sound. She stood in the church's doorway, screaming, yet no noise escaped her lips. The silence was alive, pressing against her, until she woke with a start. Morning light filtered through the curtains, but the unease lingered. The journal's words echoed in her mind. It steals memory, identity. Despite herself, Claire felt drawn to the church. The morning air was crisp as Claire stepped outside. She wandered through the quiet streets of Whispering Hollow, her thoughts returning to the journal's cryptic warnings. Her destination was the local library, a modest building nestled between the post office and an old bakery. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of aged paper. The librarian, Mrs. Hargrove, greeted Claire with a warm but cautious smile. When Claire asked about the church, the woman's face darkened. "The Church of Silence," Mrs. Hargrove said, lowering her voice. "It's been abandoned for decades. Strange things happened there, Claire. People went in and never came out. Or they left, changed." Mrs. Hargrove pulled out a faded newspaper clipping from the library archives. It detailed a series of mysterious disappearances tied to the church, dating back over a century. "They say the silence inside isn't natural," she whispered. "It's alive. It takes more than just sound." Claire's skepticism wavered. The journal, her dream, and now these stories were too aligned to dismiss. She thanked Mrs. Hargrove and left, her curiosity deepening. As she walked, she noticed townsfolk avoiding the church altogether, crossing the street to keep their distance. That evening, Claire returned to her grandmother's journal. The entries grew more erratic. "It feeds on memories. I've seen it take whole lives. But the ritual works, it must." Claire's pulse quickened. Her grandmother had known more about the church than she ever revealed. Despite her unease, Claire resolved to uncover the truth. The next morning, Claire stood at the edge of the churchyard, staring up at its crumbling facade. Ivy twisted around the stone walls, and the heavy wooden doors loomed before her like a mouth waiting to swallow her whole. She hesitated, then pushed the doors open. The moment she stepped inside, an oppressive silence enveloped her. It was unlike anything she had ever experienced. There was no echo of her footsteps, no rustle of her clothes, just a void. Claire moved cautiously down the aisle. Her heart pounded, yet she couldn't hear even that. She reached the altar and saw strange symbols carved into the wood. As she traced them with her fingers, her vision blurred. Flashes of forgotten moments flickered in her mind. Her grandmother's voice, her childhood laughter, but they slipped away as quickly as they appeared. The silence grew heavier, pressing against her chest. Claire tried to speak, to call out, but no sound emerged. Panic surged as she realized the silence was consuming her, piece by piece. She stumbled backward and fled the church. Outside, the world returned in a rush of sound. Birds chirping, leaves rustling, her own ragged breaths. But something was wrong. She couldn't remember her grandmother's face, only a vague outline. Shaken, Claire returned home and buried herself in the journal. The entries now seemed eerily familiar, as if they were her own memories. Her grandmother had warned her, "The silence erases you, but it can be stopped." The symbols in the church must be part of the ritual. Claire knew she had to return, but next time, she would be prepared. Determined to understand the ritual, Claire spent the next day piecing together the journal's cryptic instructions. Each entry seemed to hold a fragment of the solution, but many pages were missing or smeared with ink. Frustrated, she returned to the library, hoping for more clues. Mrs. Hargrove hesitated but eventually led Claire to a locked cabinet. "These are old records from the town's early days," she said. Among the brittle documents, Claire found notes from the church's original founders. They spoke of a malevolent force bound within the church, sealed by a ritual of silence. The ritual required a sacrifice, not of life, but of identity. The guardian would lose their voice and memories, becoming a vessel to contain the force. Claire's stomach turned. Had her grandmother performed this ritual? Was that why her journal was so fragmented? As she walked back to the house, the weight of the truth settled on her. Her grandmother had been the guardian, but with her passing, the church was vulnerable again. The ritual needed to be completed, and Claire suspected she was the next in line. That night, Claire studied the journal symbols, tracing them onto a piece of parchment. The ritual steps were becoming clearer, but she knew time was running out. The silence was spreading. Claire stood before the church once more, the journal in one hand and the parchment in the other. The town's silence was growing. Even the distant hum of cicadas had vanished. With a deep breath, she pushed open the doors and stepped inside. The silence was suffocating, heavier than before. Claire moved toward the altar, her footsteps swallowed by the void. Shadows began to shift around her, taking the shapes of those who had fallen victim to the silence. They reached out, their faces twisted in silent screams, warning her of the cost. Claire knelt before the altar and began the ritual. She placed the parchment over the symbols and traced them with a piece of charcoal. As she did, her mind was assaulted by flashes of memories. Her grandmother's laughter, her childhood home, her own name, all slipping away like sand through her fingers. The silence pushed back, resisting her efforts. Claire felt herself fading, her identity unraveling. She clung to the last threads of who she was, focusing on the journal's final words. The guardian must endure. In a final act of defiance, Claire completed the last symbol. A low, rumbling sound broke through the silence, and the shadows recoiled. The oppressive weight lifted, but Claire knew the cost. Her voice was gone, her memory scattered. She was no longer Claire, but the new guardian of the Church of Silence. The town slowly returned to normal. Birds sang again, and the wind rustled through the trees. Whispering Hollow's residents noticed Claire's absence, but didn't question it. They knew some sacrifices were necessary to protect their fragile peace. Inside the church, Claire stood silently, her eyes vacant but watchful. She no longer remembered her past, but faint echoes of her grandmother's love remained, guiding her purpose. She was now bound to the church, ensuring the ritual held. The journal sat on the altar, its final page blank, waiting for the next guardian to continue the cycle. Years passed. Whispering Hollow continued its quiet existence, the church standing as a silent sentinel at the town's center. Few dared approach it, but one day, a traveler arrived, drawn by whispers of its dark history. He stood before the church's doors, feeling the weight of its silence even from a distance. As he hesitated, he thought he heard faint voices calling from within, pleading for help. Against his better judgment, he stepped forward. The cycle was beginning again. The road to Willow Creek wound through dense forests, their shadows stretching long in the late afternoon light. Elena gripped the steering wheel tightly, her eyes flicking between the narrow path and the old photograph of her younger sister, Lily, pinned to the dashboard. The grief that had clung to her since Lily's death felt heavier as she crossed the town's familiar threshold. Willow Creek hadn't changed much in the years she'd been away. The same quaint houses, the same quiet streets. But something felt off, a pervasive stillness that seemed to seep into her bones. At the center of the town square stood the ancient wishing well, its stone frame darkened by moss and age. Elena hadn't thought of it in years, but its looming presence now seemed to call to her. Later that evening, after unpacking in her childhood home, she found herself wandering back to the square. The well's rim was cool under her fingers as she peered into its depths. She could barely make out the water far below, reflecting a sliver of the moonlight. "I wish," she whispered, voice breaking. Her hand trembled as she tossed a coin into the void. "I wish Lily could come back." The silence around her deepened as the coin disappeared. For a moment, Elena thought she heard a faint hum rising from the well, but it was gone as quickly as it came. Shaking off the thought, she turned and walked home, unaware of the shadow that seemed to linger behind her. Elena woke to the sound of soft knocking at the front door. For a moment, she lay still, disoriented by the pale morning light streaming through the curtains. The knock came again, more insistent this time. She hurried to the door, heart pounding. When she opened it, she froze. There on the porch stood Lily. "Morning, Elena," Lily said, her voice soft but unmistakable. Elena's breath caught. It was impossible. Yet there she was. Her sister looked exactly as she had before the accident. Her dark hair pulled back in a loose ponytail, her favorite green sweater slightly wrinkled. Tears filled Elena's eyes as she pulled Lily into a tight embrace. But as the initial shock subsided, unease began to creep in. Lily felt cold, her touch almost weightless. And when Elena pulled back to look at her, something in Lily's eyes unsettled her. They were familiar, yet distant, as if a part of her wasn't entirely there. Throughout the day, Elena watched Lily closely. At first, it was easy to dismiss the strange moments. The way Lily moved silently through the house, her expression blank when she thought Elena wasn't looking. But when they went to the local cafe for lunch, the reactions of the townsfolk were unmistakable. Mrs. Callahan, who had known their family for years, gasped and quickly turned away. Others whispered behind their hands, eyes darting nervously toward Lily. Even the cheerful hum of conversation seemed to die down whenever they entered a room. "Why is everyone acting so weird?" Elena asked as they walked back home. Lily shrugged, her face emotionless. "Maybe they're just surprised to see me." Elena tried to shake off the growing discomfort, but the pit in her stomach only deepened. Something wasn't right. That night, she sat by the window, staring at the well in the moonlight. Had her wish truly been granted, or had she brought something else back? Determined to find answers, Elena sought out Mr. Harper the next day. The town's historian had spent his entire life collecting stories about Willow Creek, and she knew he would have insight into the well's mysteries. Mr. Harper's small, cluttered office smelled of old books and pipe smoke. He greeted Elena with a weary smile, but stiffened when she mentioned Lily's return and the wish she'd made at the well. "You shouldn't have done that," he said quietly, his eyes darkening. He stood and pulled a thick, leather-bound tome from a shelf, flipping to a section filled with old sketches and faded newspaper clippings. "The well has stood in Willow Creek for centuries," Mr. Harper explained. "It's older than the town itself. They say it grants wishes, but always at a price." Elena frowned, leaning over the table as Harper pointed to a drawing of the well from the 1800s. "People have wished for wealth, health, love, and, sometimes, for the dead to return. But those who come back are never truly the same." He recounted the story of a man who wished for his wife's return after a tragic illness. She came back, but within weeks, her behavior grew increasingly erratic. By the end, she was a danger to everyone around her. The well takes something in return, sometimes a life, sometimes a soul. Elena's stomach churned as Harper continued. "The longer they stay, the worse it gets. You must send her back, Elena, before it's too late." Elena left the office in a daze, Harper's warnings echoing in her mind. As she walked through town, she noticed the wary looks from others, their gazes filled with fear and pity. She realized they all knew the truth about Lily and about the well. Over the next few days, Lily's behavior grew more unsettling. At first, it was subtle. Her long, silent stares, her disinterest in the things she once loved. Then it became impossible to ignore. One morning, Elena found Lily standing in the kitchen, staring out the window. Her breath frosted the glass, though the house wasn't cold. When Elena called her name, Lily turned slowly, her expression vacant. "I don't like them watching us," she said, her voice distant. Elena's heart skipped a beat. "Who's watching?" Lily didn't answer. Instead, she walked out of the room, leaving Elena shaken. The nightmares returned that night. Elena dreamed of the well again, its dark water swirling with shadows. She heard whispers, urgent and pleading, warning her to undo the wish. When she woke, she felt drained, her body heavy with exhaustion. The next day, things took a darker turn. Elena and Lily visited the park, but when a small child accidentally bumped into Lily, she reacted with terrifying speed. Her hand shot out, gripping the child's arm tightly. The boy's face turned pale as he gasped for air. Elena pulled Lily away, apologizing profusely to the child's horrified mother. Back home, Elena confronted her sister. "Lily, what's happening to you?" Lily's face twisted in anguish. "I don't know," she whispered. "I feel different. I remember dying, Elena. I remember everything." Elena's breath caught. "Then why did you come back?" Lily looked at her with hollow eyes. "Because you wished for me." That night, Elena sat by the well, Harper's words echoing in her mind. "You must send her back before it's too late." But how could she let Lily go again? Elena couldn't avoid the inevitable any longer. She returned to Mr. Harper, who handed her an ancient parchment covered in faded symbols. "This is the ritual," he said. "It's the only way to sever the well's hold. But be warned, it demands a sacrifice." Elena nodded, her resolve firm. That night, she led Lily to the well under the light of a full moon. The air was thick with tension, and the town square was eerily quiet. "Why are we here?" Lily asked, her voice trembling. Elena took a deep breath. "I have to fix this. I have to set you free." Lily's eyes widened as she backed away. "No, I don't want to go back." Elena began the ritual, chanting the ancient incantation Harper had given her. The symbols on the parchment glowed faintly in the moonlight as she traced them in the dirt around the well. The ground trembled, and the air grew colder. The well's water began to churn violently, and a dark figure emerged from its depths. It was shapeless, a mass of shadows with glowing eyes that bore into Elena's soul. "You dare to undo what you have asked?" The entity's voice echoed, a deep, guttural sound that shook the very ground. "Another soul must take her place." Elena hesitated. "Take me," she said, her voice steady. The entity paused, its eyes narrowing. But before it could respond, Lily stepped forward. "No, this is my fate," she said, her voice filled with quiet resolve. "I shouldn't be here." Tears streamed down Elena's face as Lily placed a hand on her shoulder. "Thank you for giving me one more chance," Lily whispered. "But it's time for me to go." The entity reached out, enveloping Lily in darkness. She smiled one last time before vanishing into the well. The water stilled, and the oppressive energy lifted. The ritual was complete. In the days that followed, Willow Creek returned to its quiet normalcy. The townsfolk resumed their routines, the unease surrounding Elena and Lily forgotten, as if a heavy fog had lifted. Elena, however, felt the weight of her decision every day. She spent hours in the town square, staring at the well, replaying the final moments with her sister. Though Lily was gone, a sense of peace lingered, her spirit finally at rest. The well stood silent, its dark history buried once more. But Elena knew it was only a matter of time before someone else, desperate and grieving, made a wish they couldn't take back. Years later, a young traveler passed through Willow Creek, captivated by the charm of its sleepy streets. He paused at the old wishing well, intrigued by its age and mystery. With a smirk, he pulled a coin from his pocket. "Why not?" he muttered, tossing it into the dark water. The faint hum of the well stirred, and the traveler felt a chill run down his spine. He turned away, unaware that the cycle had begun again. The road leading into Red Hollow felt narrower than Jake remembered. Towering pines lined the winding path, their branches casting long shadows in the fading light. He hadn't set foot in the town since he was a teenager, and now, returning felt like stepping into a ghost story. Jake's father had died a week ago, and the weight of their unresolved past was heavier than the duffel bag slung over his shoulder. Their relationship had been strained for years, and Jake carried the guilt of every unanswered call, every unspoken apology. The town itself hadn't changed much. The same peeling storefronts, the same rusted gas station signs swaying in the breeze. As Jake parked outside his father's small house, the memories came rushing back, painful and vivid. The house was exactly as he remembered, a relic of the past, frozen in time. Inside, the air was stale, carrying the faint scent of old leather and engine oil. Sorting through his father's belongings, Jake found himself lingering on a photograph of them fishing together when he was a child. It was a rare moment of peace between them, and it stirred something deep within him. Later that evening, Jake wandered into the local diner for a meal. The bell above the door jingled as he stepped inside, drawing a few curious glances. An old friend, Ethan, approached him with a wary smile. "Didn't think I'd see you back here," Ethan said, sliding into the booth across from Jake. After some small talk, Ethan's tone grew serious. "You remember that road outside town? People say if you drive it at night, you might not come back." Jake scoffed. "Come on, Ethan. That's just a story." Ethan's expression didn't change. "Maybe. Just don't drive that way." Sleep eluded Jake that night. He tossed and turned, the weight of unfinished business, with his father pressing on his chest. The house was too quiet, too filled with memories that gnawed at him. Finally, unable to bear the silence, he grabbed his keys and headed for his truck. The streets of Red Hollow were deserted as he drove through the sleeping town. His mind replayed Ethan's warning, but Jake pushed it aside, telling himself it was just a tale to scare kids. The road stretched ahead, and without thinking, Jake took the old route that led out of town. The further he drove, the more the road seemed to change. The trees grew denser, their gnarled branches reaching over the asphalt like skeletal fingers. The moonlight struggled to penetrate the thick canopy above. Jake felt a strange tension in the air, but kept driving, hoping the motion would clear his head. After what felt like 20 minutes, he passed a familiar broken-down gas station. It seemed odd. He could have sworn he'd passed it already. Shaking his head, Jake kept driving. But 5 minutes later, there it was again, the same rusted pumps and shattered windows. His grip tightened on the steering wheel as unease prickled his skin. He checked the clock on the dashboard. It was frozen. The gas gauge hadn't moved either, despite the miles he thought he'd driven. A sinking feeling settled in his stomach. He turned the truck around, heart pounding, and drove back the way he came. But no matter how far he drove, the same landmarks repeated. The gas station, a crooked mile marker, a gnarled tree split by lightning. Panic began to set in. He was trapped on the road, and it was toying with him. Jake pulled over, his hands shaking. The air felt heavier now, pressing down on him. In the rearview mirror, he thought he saw something, a shadow that didn't belong to the trees. He spun around, but nothing was there. The endless road had him, and it wasn't letting go. Jake's knuckles whitened as he gripped the steering wheel. His breaths came shallow and fast, but he forced himself to keep driving. Logic told him the road had to end somewhere. He couldn't be stuck in a loop. It defied reason. Yet the landmarks continued to repeat. The gas station, the mile marker, the split tree. Each time he passed them, they seemed more distorted, as if the road itself was bending reality. Desperation gnawed at him. He slammed the brakes and shouted into the emptiness, his voice swallowed by the oppressive silence. Determined to break free, Jake tried turning onto a narrow dirt path that veered off the main road. For a moment, he thought he'd found an escape, but after only a few minutes, the dirt path merged back into the endless asphalt, the gas station appearing once more on the horizon. Jake's frustration boiled over. "What do you want from me?" he yelled, slamming his fist on the dashboard. His voice echoed strangely in the confined cab of the truck. Then the visions began. At first, they were fleeting, shadows in the periphery, like dark smudges on the night. But soon, they became clearer. In the rearview mirror, Jake saw a familiar figure. His father, sitting in the passenger seat, face expressionless. Jake jerked his head around, but the seat was empty. His heart raced as memories surfaced unbidden. The last argument with his father, harsh words exchanged, doors slammed. Jake had left without saying goodbye, and now those memories played like a haunting film, looping just like the road. The visions grew more intense. His father appeared again, this time mouthing words Jake couldn't hear. The guilt Jake had been burying clawed its way to the surface. He realized the road wasn't just endless. It was a mirror, forcing him to confront everything he'd been running from. The next loop brought Jake face to face with something different. As he rounded a bend, his headlights illuminated a car parked on the shoulder, a rusted sedan, its tires flat, its windows fogged. Jake pulled over cautiously. Maybe whoever was inside could help. Approaching the car, he noticed a journal lying on the dashboard. The driver's seat was empty, the door slightly ajar. Jake hesitated before picking up the journal, its leather cover cold and cracked. Flipping through the pages, he found entries describing the same phenomena he was experiencing: endless loops, distorted landmarks, and visions of lost loved ones. The road feeds on guilt, one entry read. It traps you in your worst memories, forcing you to relive your regrets. The only way out is to confront them. Jake's hands trembled as he read further. The journal's final pages were scrawled with desperate pleas. "I see her every time, but she's not real." The last entry chilled him. "The road will not release me. It has no end." As Jake stood by the sedan, the air shifted. He turned sharply, his father's ghostly figure now standing a few feet away. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow. "Why did you leave?" the apparition asked, its voice hollow but piercing. Jake stumbled back, the journal falling from his hands. His voice caught in his throat. "I didn't mean to. I didn't know how to fix things." His father stepped closer, his form flickering like a dying light. "You've been running from this your whole life. You think you can escape it?" Jake's chest tightened, tears stinging his eyes. The road wasn't just a trap. It was a purgatory, a punishment for his unresolved guilt. He knew now that there was no driving his way out. The only escape lay in facing the truth he'd long avoided. Jake climbed back into his truck, his mind racing. He gripped the steering wheel tightly and began driving again, determined to face whatever the road threw at him. The shadows grew denser, the visions more vivid. Each loop brought a new torment. The sound of his father's voice, the echoes of their final argument. The road twisted once more, and this time Jake found himself in front of his childhood home. The truck's engine sputtered and died, leaving him in complete silence. He stepped out, heart pounding, as the door to the house creaked open. Inside, the house was just as he remembered. The living room was bathed in a cold, gray light, and his father sat in his old armchair, staring at the empty fireplace. Jake hesitated, then stepped forward. "Dad," he said softly, his voice breaking. The figure turned, its eyes filled with sorrow. "You left without saying goodbye," it said, its tone carrying the weight of years. "You never came back." Jake's throat tightened. "I was angry. I thought I had more time." His voice cracked as tears streamed down his face. "I'm sorry. I should have been there." The figure stood, approaching him slowly. "It's not about the time you had. It's about what you did with it." Jake sank to his knees, the full weight of his guilt crashing down on him. "I want to make it right. I don't know how, but I want to fix it." The figure placed a hand on Jake's shoulder, and for the first time, Jake felt a sense of warmth, a hint of forgiveness. The room around him began to dissolve, the oppressive weight of the road lifting. "You can't change the past," his father's voice echoed, fading into the void. "But you can choose how it shapes you." As the vision faded, Jake found himself back in his truck. The road ahead stretched out, but this time, he felt a shift. The loop was breaking. The first rays of dawn peeked over the horizon as Jake drove forward. The landmarks he had seen on repeat were gone, replaced by a clear stretch of road leading back to Red Hollow. The endless road had released him. Jake pulled over at the town's edge, his hands trembling. The weight in his chest had lessened, though his heart still ached with the memory of his father. But now, it was a different kind of pain. A reminder to live with purpose, not regret. He drove back to his father's house, ready to finally move forward. Weeks later, a man in a sleek black car passed through Red Hollow, unaware of its dark legend. He followed his GPS, which directed him onto a quiet, winding road just outside of town. As he drove, the air grew heavier, the trees denser. The man frowned, noticing the same mile marker passing by again and again. His phone lost signal, and the gas gauge froze. The endless road had found its next victim.